Welcome to IEP Radio, a show dedicated to the education of all things indoor environmental quality related. And now here's your host, Michael Schrantz.
Welcome everybody to IEP Radio. This is episode 11, and today we're going to be talking with Eric Dorninger. Probably when I think about all of the clinicians I've worked with over the years, one of the best, closest relationships I've had. I have the utmost respect for this guy. He has taught me so much, brought me into his circle of trust, and learned so much about chronic illness. And, you know, it's this whole village thing that we've been talking about on this podcast. You know, it's multiple angles that's working together with people. And as an IEP, we're trying to diagnose that at home. But, you know, that doesn't mean we understand health. We're not trying to play doctor out there in the field. And I think that's where a lot of us go wrong, where we need to take a step back and learn about the clinical side of this, looking at those patients and see how we can synergistically, you know, work together, find that testing and see how we can help answer questions of exposure and help address that ultimate goal, maybe of recovery or sanctuary, that sort of thing. So I'd like to welcome to the show, Dr. Dorninger. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Wow, circle of trust.
Yeah.
Meet the Fockers, I'm in, baby. Yeah, so good to see you, Michael. You know, you're my partner in crime on this dynamic duo approach we have to do for getting CIRS patients to the finish line. If we can't get these people into clean, good quality air, it's an obstacle to cure that we cannot get out of the way. And then cases get confusing. We were just chatting a little bit about how you might also have comorbidity, you might have mast cell activation syndrome, or you might also have cerebral palsy, or you might also have a gastric bleed, and CIRS might participate in that in regards to Richie seeing something like mild gastritis and higher amounts in our CIRS patients because of the lack of MSH and border protection these patients have for their tubal linings. But at the end of the day, if you can't clear biotoxin pathway and get that reset of hypothalamus regulation of the body, these patients are going to have all kinds of other shenanigans that they're doctor hopping for. So without you, I'm telling you, you guys always smile and think I'm hitting on you because of the bromance I have for anybody who is able to really get down and dirty with me and say, is this building frigging clean? And the reason that's so dear to my heart is I've just seen so many failed experiments with glutathione or tonifying systems or versions of functional medicine or misdiagnoses because we can't get real with the criteria that define CIRS and the first step. You need to be in clean building.
So it's crazy, you know, there's so much. I mean, even in the last 2 or 3 minutes, what you've just absorbed and heard from Eric, it just shows you how complicated it can be. It sure is a far step away from like that typical doctor's visit where you go in their office for 8 minutes, they check vitals, treat for symptoms. Even a lot of us IEPs now know that story to be true. It's crazy how somebody who maybe started in a conventional medicine approach in school can transition. And I don't want to pry too much, Eric, but what about your background? I mean, how did you get involved in functional medicine, if I'm even saying that right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I thought I wanted to be an ER doc, actually. I started riding with the ambulance, and emergency medicine makes sense to me. But I realized that the job of the ER is to make sure you don't die today. That's it. And it's a big job. It's an important job, but I have to make sure if I was an ER doc, sew you up, make sure that you're not bleeding out, make sure you're not taking your own life if you're in suicidal crisis, et cetera, et cetera. Then I just discharge you back to your dysfunctional physiology, right? I just send you back out there and you're off having multi-symptoms, multiple systems involved. You're just miserable. You're financially struggling sometimes. You're cognitively struggling. Sexual function isn't there. Ability to have a good workout and get out in nature isn't happening. And I just said there's got to be a better way. So when I was riding with the ambulance, I'm grateful for the exposure I had for all the miracles of modern medicine and things like drugs and surgery and what we can do to manipulate and override biochemistry to keep people here. But 2/3 to 3/4 of all medical problems are chronic illness. These are people who are not in the ER, or if they went in, they went for a UTI for the 5th time and no one figures out why they keep getting UTIs. And then they're discharged back into their life. So I had a vision, a true vision of healthcare and what could be in this world. And I was telling a platonic girlfriend at the time, she and I were BSing about healthcare. And she said, oh, that's naturopathic medicine. There's this philosophy you're envisioning is naturopathic medicine. It already exists. You're not the first one to think this way. And I went on this thing called the internet back in the early 90s, and up came Bastyr University in Seattle, National College of Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, which is now National University of Naturopathic Medicine, or Nunham, and Southwest in Arizona. And there was literally the school name, address, and telephone number. And you called the telephone number, got your swag bag of all the pamphlets and all this cool stuff. And it was something called the therapeutic order that lit my heart on fire. I mean, woke me up. And I had been through my own health stuff. I had an interesting run with drugs and alcohol. And my health was not a good expression of life potential and how I wanted to live my life. And I really had, I'll spare you all the details of my personal journey, but this massive brush with death and not feeling well that made me say, all right, got to find my purpose in life. And as I started to heal myself, this pursuit in a better way to do healthcare became my passion. And the therapeutic order is what drew me to it. And I actually spoke on this at the Arizona conference with Dr. Shoemaker. If you remember, I overlaid the therapeutic order with my hair is raising, with Richie Shoemaker's biotoxin pathway treatment protocol. Right. And the very first step of therapeutic order is remove obstacle to cure. And because cure is such a loaded word, we say remove obstacles to healing, right? Because a lot of times our patient population, your client population, we're taking from a D- or an F up to maybe a C+, B- to start. And then we try and polish them to a B+, A-. They're probably never going to be an A+, but nor is their friend who's going type 2 diabetes from PubGrub and, 3 Vice beers every night. Yep. And their sedentary lifestyle and being overtech and all that other stuff. So if you get these people up to B+ physiology up from a D- F, they're pretty stoked on their new quality of life, and they can engage in marriage and be a better parent and start making money again and so on and so forth. So it was that remove obstacles to healing that blew my mind. I said, that's how my brain is thinking. I got to go hang out with the bumblebees who are also thinking that way. The second step is reestablish healthy regimen. And this is a lot of times what a CIRS patient comes to our office already having in place. That's things like kick toxic relationships to the curb, drink healthy water and drink lots of water and stay hydrated, eat healthy food. A lot of our CIRS patients are paleo. They're doing yoga and CrossFit. They're hydrated. They're going to bed on time. They're taking tech fasts. They are not better. Why? There's an obstacle in the way to their physiology. And then the third step is stimulate the VIS. VIS is vital force. That's some of the Wim Hof stuff. Do the breathing, cold showers, acupuncture, hit the right homeopathic remedy, do some of the Chinese Qigong stuff, maybe certain Kundalini yoga, that kind of stuff. And then the fourth step is tonify systems. And even though I believe in supplements and nutraceuticals, right, you don't have a turmeric deficiency. You don't have a CBD THC deficiency. You don't have a ginger deficiency. These are novel anti-inflammatories that are very powerful medicines if implemented properly in dosage, but they're not an obstacle to cure. And then the fifth one's correct structural integrity. You could actually hurt someone if you adjust their neck, right? But sometimes getting a neck adjustment or putting a rib in is the best thing since sliced bread. It's just, it comes with a higher risk for harm versus, hey, go to bed a little earlier. Right.
Sometimes that obstacle, I mean, not to transition so quickly, but it feels like you can do these things, but if they're in an environment that's triggering them, it doesn't matter what you're doing or what rib you're putting back in place or how much yoga they're doing in a day. How does that fall in your line of work? This is what we see a lot of times. A majority of the clinicians that I work with and a lot of the colleagues that, we share, stories and what it's always about the environment. I mean, in chronic illness, is it like, can every industry point at the home or the building and go, this is likely a trigger?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll just say the sixth one because it kind of closes the.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I'm trying to. Yep.
No, it's perfect. That we're doing the circle today,
Okay.
right?
We'll
The
talk about
circle,
circles. Okay.
circle of trust, and you can trust in the therapeutic order. It never fails me, nor does the biotoxin protocol. And we'll get from Dr. Shoemaker, but we'll get to that. The sixth one is drugs and surgery. I'm not a medical racist. I don't think that conventional model for chronic illness is stupid. I just think it's limited, right? So drugs and surgery, when judiciously applied, make total sense. But that probably means we'd be doing 10% of our back surgeries, right? So go back to that fifth one, and you were talking about our chronically ill. I think it's crazy to neck adjust a CIRS patient who's totally inflamed before stripping that inflammation. So I go out on the road and I teach holistic MDs and NDs and DCs and nurse practitioners and acupuncturists. And I tell a lot of the chiros, I'm like, you guys are crazy to touch some of the bodies you're working on with high force intervention before you strip some of that inflammation out there with diet and lifestyle. But again, with CIRS and to what you were just saying with that remove obstacle to cure, let's just take biotoxin out of the game for a second. If we have someone who we missed their sleep apnea, you have a very similar picture to biotoxin because the patient goes hypoxic, right? We just diagnosed my dad with apnea because his blood pressure was out of control, and the underlying cause for his hypertension wasn't lack of meds, it was sleep apnea. He was having 98 events per hour. Yeah. You're supposed to have 5 or less. So he was literally getting his restorative sleep disrupted more than every 45 seconds.
Understood.
Right? So we know from the biotoxin pathway, one of the reasons you get multi-system, multi-symptom illness is your capillaries, not if we put a pulse ox on your finger here, but your capillaries don't deliver oxygen into the cell to make 38 units of energy or ATP per glucose molecule burned. And you go into anaerobic metabolism or 8 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule burned. And when I explain that to patients, I try and keep it blue collar. I just say 2 people start at Target. They're both in $20,000 credit card debt. They have massive debt. It's a 30% credit card interest. It's a high interest card. They both get hired for the same job. One gets $8 an hour. The other gets $38 an hour. Who's getting out alive? Right? So our CIRS patients don't make energy, nor do our sleep apnics, nor does someone with anemia, nor does someone who's been smoking their whole life. They've destroyed their lung parenchyma, and now they can't exchange oxygen. So chapter 6 of Surviving Mold, one of the most powerful chapters I've ever read from any doctor, Dr. Shoemaker, follow the oxygen, right? So you're saying, so how do we get it into patients' heads that there might be more than diet and exercise, diet and lifestyle at play here?
You got me on the seat on my edge, on the edge of my seat here. But I mean, because you're telling us something, but you're not giving us everything. So what is it?
Yeah. So you have to have CIRS. So the biggest problem with functional medicine is people are focusing on diet and lifestyle and how to function better and how to nutraceutical load. I'm down with all of it. None of it gets breakthrough healthcare experiences if you miss the obstacle to cure. Right? And that's why I say I don't do functional medicine primarily. I do it secondarily. I do diagnostic medicine first.
Yeah.
If you're CIRS and I give you turmeric or glutathione or I give you CBDs, all of your symptoms will improve. You'll feel a little bit better. And that's important to keep people going. Right. But you won't graduate from healthcare. And we don't like codependency in our clinic. We don't like abandonment either. We want to stay there with you, but we want to graduate you from our office.
Gotcha. So right. What are you looking at then? Or what you're obviously establishing that there's a certain order or process that's effective. I know that to be true just because I know you.
Yeah.
Where do we start? I mean, like you said, you wouldn't do chiropractic work on somebody with inflammation. Yeah. Maybe someone who had CIRS. So we don't start there.
Yeah. So I'm still looking for that main line to God. I want to just have my red phone and call them and be like, what is the underlying causes for this patient, right?
Fair enough.
No one's given me a crystal ball that works yet,
yeah.
right? So when a patient comes in and they have this laundry list of symptoms, which, by the way, conventional model calls diagnoses, this is a problem. IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. Yeah, thanks, doc. I could have told you I'm gassy and bloaty and my bowels are irritable all the time. I figured it out. You have chronic fatigue syndrome.
There it is.
I know, jackass. I just told you that I'm tired all the time. And you're telling me I have tired all the time syndrome, right? So we come in with these laundry of symptoms that are made into ICD-10 diagnoses, and they're not. They're just symptoms. So from there, and Richie Shoemaker is one of my top 3 guides to staying clean on this. From there, as a doctor, you're supposed to write a differential diagnosis of this could be causing all these things, 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 or some of them, or what we usually see in the CIRS patient, many straws that are breaking the camel's back. You know, maybe we do have some diet and lifestyle to work on, but and then you go to the laboratory evaluation, you go to the imaging evaluation to prove yes or no, your differential diagnosis is right or you're wrong. And that's called ruling stuff in or ruling stuff out. Now, why I thank God for Dr. Shoemaker every day. I'm dead serious on that. We would be sick as hell, my personal family, because we are activated CIRS patients who are now treated and functional again. But the criteria, the laboratory diagnostics, getting a visual contrast sensitivity test, looking at clustered symptoms, now loading on the NeuroQuant, which is a brain MRI on steroids, and now the Geni test can definitively tell us if CIRS is the diagnosis or not.
Can you, not to change the subject too much, but can you elaborate just an ounce on the Geni? I know that's a newer term for a lot of us.
Yeah, so basically, I think one of the best ways to do it is compare Geni to 23andMe.
Oh, okay.
Because a lot of people do 23andMe, and that's just something people are familiar with. 23andMe looks at SNP chip technology, and SNP chip technology just looks at if you have genes or not. That's all it looks at. So let's take the celiac gene, the HLA-DQ2 or the HLA-DQ8. Just having that gene doesn't guarantee you have celiac. And we've talked about this. Genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. Genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. So if I have that celiac gene and I have never been exposed to gluten, good luck, America, right? I've never had waffles. I've never had pizza. I've never done pasta loading for the soccer tournament, right? If I've never had exposure, I grew up on the Galapagos Islands and I'm eating bark and berries and fish, right?
God bless you.
Yeah, you're not going to be diabetic. You're not going to have heart disease. You're probably going to be pretty happy. You're going to be virile. You know, you're going to just run around. You know, maybe there's a little Lord of Flies, and you go.
You'd be lucky to find a loincloth. That's all.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. But if you don't get the exposure, the gene doesn't wake up. So what 23andMe does, all it does is it looks at, do you have these genes? Good genes and bad genes, right? What Geni does is it says, are the genes turned on for better and worse? And that's called transcription and translocation. So to take genetic code from your nuclei and turn it on, you need transcription translation, which is basically something called messenger RNA that basically codes the proteins. So you've heard us talking about MMP9 and C4A and C3A and TGF-beta1. These are all genetic turn-ons that then show up in the bloodstream. So before we had Geni, it was still plenty to diagnose a CIRS case. You would look at the HLA, which is, HLA means human leukocyte antigen, or in plain English, on chromosome 6, immune response genetics. Do you have genes for inflammatory diseases from mom and dad, right? Do you have genes for, and there's HLA for everything, right? We are unwinding HLA. There's HLA for psoriatic arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis and celiac and CIRS. And everyone's like tripping out on MTHFR. And I'm like, that is so downstream. The action is on chromosome 6 because those are the genes of inflammation. And that's what I deal with all day. Dealing with dementia, inflammation. Dealing with calcified plaque in the arteries, inflammation. Dealing with depression, inflammation. You saw Dr. Ackerley's presentation in Arizona.
Yep.
Every single mood disorder has elevated interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory marker. They're all based on inflammation: attention deficit, schizophrenia, depression, autism, ADD, yada, yada, yada. So what we had initially from Richie's hard-ass work, I mean, unbelievable what he's done over the last 2 decades, is we had the gene and we could look at what I call performance markers to show, is that static gene we looked at turned on, right? It was a little bit of a leap's not the right word, but it was. Could
you say ancillary data? It was just something to indicate.
That's right. And the reason I'm so confident in that method is because Richie proved that you could use those performance markers to prove exposure, and then to prove the treatment was working, and then to normalize the patient.
Yeah, right.
Right. Now, what Geni does is it can tell us, if you think Michael Schranz, and this is where you're on the hot seat, brother, if you think Michael Schranz's clearance testing is true or not, and they're only living in the building you cleared, we can see if actinomyces or endotoxin or molds are still turning on inflammation in that body. Right? And that's where it gets really exciting.
This would be, I was going to say that this would be, this is a fantasy in the making, because back in Salisbury, I think 2018, when they had little, surviving mold get together, I think Dr. Jimmy Ryan, who's been a big part of this whole transcriptomic research and that whole thing, we were trying to dumb it down, probably of all the audience members, for me the most, and talk about what can this help us do. Never mind the clinical approach, you've already kind of shown that value, or at least indicated it. For IEPs, how does that translate in very plain English? And here's the very plain English. There may be a day, you could say maybe qualitatively there already is this, but there'll be a way that this solidifies to the point where a doctor can call you up with a mutual client where there's permission to talk, and they could be, we know that there's a gram-positive bacteria causing inflammation in this home. We want you to focus on that. And it's one more opportunity for the IEP. It's one more tool for us to use and correlate to save these people money, not waste it. Because this is the issue, is a lot of the testing in the field, people are spending arguably thousands of dollars in the end just to assess, not even necessarily to remediate, repair, and maintain sanctuary.
Right.
And so I would be, hot seat for the validity of my own testing. Yeah, you're right. I've never claimed perfection. In fact, most of my reports are disclaimers about all the limitations, because we do respect what we know and don't know. But what I would argue is, I'd love to have something like that. How fantastic of a tool would that be to talk with Mr. or Mrs. Smith, the patient, and say, well, we have spoken with your doctor, and he or she has indicated that you have upregulation, downregulation of a particular gene, and we can tell that this is the type of contaminant that can cause it. It may not even be microbial related. It may be chemical, household products, off-gassing of building materials. It seems like the sky's the limit.
Well, and I think you're laying the future where we are already trying Robin Hood. Remember, rich people get CIRS too. And it's no joke. You can have all the money in the world and your life still sucks, right? Because your physiology doesn't work. But that's where we try in Robin Hood. We serve them at our highest, and then these tricks that you're suggesting, Geni is expensive. Geni is a pain in the butt to draw. You have to dry ice it. It can only get pulled on Monday. You need an in-house phlebotomist if you want to micromanage it and make sure it gets done right. And it's not a refined test in regards to practicalities yet. Right. You have to have failed traditional CIRS treatment in our office, because that's still relatively cheaper. But you're right, where the future is probably, we say, and again, if I get braggadocious, it's about my peers that I get to learn from. You'll hear me brag about Dr. Shoemaker. You will definitely hear me brag about Michael Schranz as what I think, and again, don't blush on me, brother, but you're the number one IEP in the globe. The way you're an academic and you have the blue collar, and I think that's what you need. We were just talking before we got on about another textbook you have for your world. I don't know many IEPs who study, and you need to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just got like a little weekend course and you do your job. But I think the future is, if I wanted that main line to God to get my differential diagnosis ironed out, you'd want God to grant you X-ray vision.
Right. Yeah.
So you could see behind every wall. And when we refer someone to you, even though I tell them, look, you're not going to get better in the industry, but Mr. Trance also doesn't have X-ray vision. And if you really want to see everywhere where you could have water damage, you have to do destruction of every single wall, what you guys would call destructive inspection, right? So we're trying to figure out, is there water damage or microbial growth behind that wall without demoing the wall?
So maybe that's a great transition, because you've touched only on about 1,000 valid topics here that I can salivate at. But one that strikes really close to me is this. It's the passion that we both have to help clients. You know, you got to fall in love with the work, because the work will wear you out otherwise. And it's also, not to go total off course here, but I find a lot of people, they start in it because they've had an exposure, you being an example of that. They've experienced it firsthand. So it's like that whole thing, almost dying and then believing.
But I would say it was twofold for me. And we talked about this in what we want to talk about, but it's my native Austrian father. Yeah, Eric, if you're going to do something, do it right the first time. Right. And for me, I was never satisfied, even with my naturopathic training, which got closer to, are we really getting diagnoses for these patients? So it was always about problem solving. I've been doing what I call mystery illness for 18 years. But for the first 10, I wasn't taught CIRS. So it wasn't on my differential diagnosis.
No. Right.
And I'm a guy who's dedicated my life to solving the unsolvable.
Right.
So you're never going to, it would be a rare day with pigs flying over the moon for your average primary care to pick up that we need to run CIRS on you. Right. And that's where we have to bring this into the naturopathic medical schools and the conventional medical schools. And it's so weird that Richie's been so turned away by his own alma mater, Duke University. He's a juggernaut. So yes, I appreciate the passion, but for me, it's like I always wanted to solve problems. Then I truly think it was divine intervention where God wanted me to understand just how hardcore this illness is.
Right.
And that's where we've talked about, I've had 41 isolated water damage experiences in my one home.
Yeah.
And that's where, at the risk of sounding haughty or stupid or just being goofy, I'm a better IEP than most of them out there.
Oh, there's no doubt. I know clinicians that are quick studies, and I know guys and girls that are out there practicing, who they're just old dogs, and right, wrong, or indifferent. They not to get totally off topic, but it's important here, and that is they don't even understand the difference between looking at an exposure from an acute standpoint, like your arm's going to fall off, there's 20 square feet of mold, there's clearly an issue, versus the model, which is more typical of what you and I see, which is a house that otherwise presents well, meaning visually it doesn't look that problematic. And yes, there's exceptions. There's the moldy crawl space in the basement, or the musty smell, those sorts of things. But it's just, when we are fighting the good fight for chronic illness, it implies that it may be low dose. It may be of a low concentration that most people are okay with. So the same home that someone's going to live to be 120 in is the same home that the wife or husband is having a problem to the point of not functioning, bedridden. And it's complicated, because where do you throw your money at? We would be lying to those listening if we acted like this as a mainstream, well-established practice. This is tip of the spear. We know a lot, but we don't know a lot because we've known it for centuries. We're learning it. We're acquiring it at a fast pace. It's been incredible. The journey has been such an opportunity. I'm doing my best to keep up with chapter 1 on this stuff, and just try to connect the dots, all for the same reason as I want to make a change and help people. That was the point of this podcast. The creation of it was to be able to help these folks hear you give this perspective. And you mentioned something earlier. You mentioned, I think it was the HLA, or the genes were the gun, the environment was the trigger, or something to that effect.
Genetics is the gun, loaded.
Yep.
Not shooting any bullets.
Yep.
right? And the environment, which again, depending on which HLA we talk about, is the drugs you take, right? And at one dose of antibiotics wipes out your gut biome forever, right? Now, again, naturopathic world, we try and say for freaking 30 years now, 300 years ago, Father Knipe said, treat the gut, treat the gut, treat the gut, right? We feed you sauerkraut. We're trying to get that gut biome back, right? The air we breathe, the food we eat, the chemicals we take in, right? If you want to get depressed, but also kind of fired up, watch The Devil We Know on Netflix. That was all about Teflon and the toxin C8, which is now found in 99% of human blood.
Great.
So you go to Chinese, you pull their blood, they get C8. Australian C8. The only place they found no C8 is in blood they pulled on American GIs who were in Korean War before they were exposed to Teflon on the market.
Yeah, there it is.
Right.
Yeah.
But now you're not using Teflon. It's in your 3M couch so that your wine spill doesn't screw it up. It's in your Gore-Tex that we just wore in Winter Park for our ski gear, right? So we all have C8 in our households somehow. And then the one that but I think there's been a lot more focus on chemical exposure. You know, Joe Pizzurno, one of the founders of Bastyr, is really good about that. You know, we talked about Dr. Carnahan. That's, I think, more her passion is chemical toxicity. Mm-hmm. What people blow off is the air quality. And you say tip of the spear. And I love that you're not trying to cause a riot or be Chicken Little, but the tip of the spear is 1/4 of 400 million Americans have the HLA for CIRS, water damaged buildings.
Right.
1/4. And what I love about what Richie said is there was usually, like you're saying, and this is where the concept of total load in naturopathic medicine comes in, you have the gene. How many water damage experiences does it take before you pull the trigger?
Right.
And what Richie discovered was there was usually a concomitant disturbance in the immune system. It was you were living in the moldy building for a while with the gene, then you got a really bad flu. We had a woman who was living in the moldy building during pregnancy, which is a wild Th1, Th2 immune confusion. Pregnancy is beautiful, it's romantic, but man, is it a crazy immune ride for mom. And then she got strep, and then she triggered CIRS.
She always had it. It just was what pulled the trigger.
It just, yes, that as we were talking before, now the transcription translation would be picked up on a Geni of the genes are expressing chronic inflammatory responses.
And let's just call it like it is. It's another bit of, I'm not trying to under or overvalue it, but it's another ancillary piece of data to really help support something. Because keep in mind, like maybe there's a lot of underlying questions or themes here. And I think the theme is how much evidence do we need to justify what protocol we have you on? If this costs $1 day and 10 cents, this podcast would have been over 15 minutes ago. Just do this for a day, cost you 10 cents, we're done. So it's really about being able to get as much data we can to express a long-term chronic issue, which is very hard for a lot of people, understandably so, in an old model of thinking to appreciate and do anything about. So they remain in that moldy or water damaged building, or they I can't tell you the number of clients that I walk into, or even before I'll talk to them on the phone. It's kind of an intro. Let's get to appreciate your situation, see if I can even be of any help. They underplay leaks, and you go out there and, you know, I had a little leak there, but we fixed it, no problem. The bottom shelf of their kitchen sink is warped, you know, and it's like, this wasn't a little leak. We had a little sewage backup, but we got right on it. But it's loaded with contaminants. And it's, we're not suggesting that we know because you've had those events that definitely had an exposure, but these are the low-hanging fruits in the world of chronic illness. You want a high-hanging fruit? Try finding a little bit of mold hidden in the wall when there's no plumbing source and it's on an interior wall. It really is an art beyond the science that we do use.
Yeah. Well, I think you bring up 3 guilty parties for me. And this is where, and again, I just want people to critically think more in this country. That's all I'm praying for. And I don't think we have a Republican problem. I don't think we have a Democratic problem. I think we have an integrity problem. And I think there's no better example of that problem than in construction practices. It is the cheesiest, lack of integrity, no pride, all about the bottom line. How do we just whip up crap, collect our money and go, right? And again, it comes back to my dad him and his sister were 2 of 9 children who immigrated to the States in the 60s. And I have 7 aunts and uncles across the pond, and my cousin lays tile. And when you see how that guy lays tile, it's a Picasso. And he does it for him. He doesn't do it for the homeowner. It's because his ethics, his pride, his integrity is on the line. This is my work. And you leave where he tiled. It is exquisite, right? And he always had that drive to do things right the first time.
Yeah,
right?
We're cutting corners in the world we live in.
We are, and I'm like, when I listen to our politicians, I'm like, hey guys, you're both right. Yes, we need safety programs. Yes, we need to figure out how we're going to pay for them. There's just like, everyone gets so emotional, and there's 3 guilty parties to emotionality. There's the patient or the client whose house you're evaluating. There's the IEP, and there's the practitioner.
Okay, let's hit on it.
And the only thing that I have control of is being honest with, this is your obstacle to cure. And you will not get out alive until we address it. And I have to thank Dr. Richie Shoemaker for that, because in 2003, we had massive floods in Boulder, Colorado. My side street here, Pitkin, was 40 foot wide, about 10 inches to 2 feet deep water, just a river going down. The college kids were taking their 4-wheelers through it, and they were biking their mountain bikes through it. Then the freaking the water got poopy, because there was also our sewer system backlit, and manholes were popping up. I mean, it was the most water. You know, you live in Colorado and you see the hurricanes in Houston, or you see Katrina or Irene, because I grew up going to Jersey Shore, and you just say, man, it's incredible what these people go through. And then you see that amount of water.
Yeah.
And anyone who had a fan thought they were a mitigator.
There it is.
It was so intensely discussing. Oh yeah, we figured it out. 5 days in, we got it cut out. You know, so you and I have had this conversation too many times, where in your job, in my job, you don't want to tell people things they don't want to hear, right? I have grown doctors I teach who can't even tell patients you can't eat gluten, right? Diagnosed on lab, you're making antibodies to gluten, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Every time you eat this, you're going to wind up inflammation in your body. It is straight in the peer-reviewed literature over and over again, how it can drive ataxia, how it can drive dementia, how it can drive heart disease, you name it. They get, well, a little bit. Okay, Mrs. Smith, blah, blah. No, it's no, right? And with water damaged buildings, until you put on your adult gonads and tell patients you will not get better until you're out of water damage, you are underserving them.
So let's pick on
integrity problem.
Let's
but last thing I'll say, because you and I have had many dinners over this topic, where I need the IEPs, the indoor environmental professionals, to get real when I'm referring them a Shoemaker patient. If you are a biotoxin patient, we really need to do it right the first time, or else every bit of energy, every bit of money, every bit of resources we put on that case will fail.
So for the benefit of the audience, and playing dumb here for that purpose, tell me in your eyes what you see is really working from the perspective of, I see an IEP doing this. This seems to be helping us get to that road for recovery, getting some action done, getting some remedial work. Where do you see that's working?
Well, I don't want to take your hat. I rely on you for this,
No, I'm okay to go there.
Again, big picture. And one of the coolest things about the CIRS conferences, the Shoemaker CIRS conferences, is it's half indoor environmental professional day and half clinician day.
Right.
So the IEPs sit in with the doctors and learn our world, and the doctors sit in with the IEPs and we learn their world. And I could tear up with that model, because I will not miss an indoor environmental professional talk. They are so good, from simple things like rugs are the devil. You're just not going to do well with rugs, again, some throw rugs and stuff like that you can throw in with some borax, yada, 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 to, how to do a roof right and to move or not to move. Just all these great talks you guys do. But what I've learned from you guys is the average real estate inspection is a whitewash to keep things selling, right?
Certainly feels that way.
We're going to do some air samples. And again, for 3/4 of the population, air quality is important for everybody. But if you're not having major physiological dysfunction in your life, I could give a rat's. My kids aren't coming to play in your house. Right? But we're not doing sleepovers over there, right? You don't need to spend money if everyone in your family is fine, right? But for that 1/4 of the population, doing something like air sampling and a little visual inspection is not enough. And, what I've learned from you guys, and again, I'm really curious if you can correct me here. Some of the concerns with air sampling is the World Health Organization's 2009 paper on microbial growth from water damage. You need to air sample for multiple days, multiple hours over multiple days over multiple weeks to really get accurate data. And I know there's like you screwed some holes in some wall cavities in my own home and took some air samples, and it was a more concentrated pull of that air. And there's ways that you use air samples.
It's a methodology.
It's more data, but where you could get faked out, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think the issue is to tap on the issue of air samples versus dust samples. I've already done a podcast on it, and I'm glad you brought it up because it just reemphasizes, like, this is what I was talking about in that other podcast. In real life, is that typical spore trap sampling, which is arguably what many we'll call them mold inspectors. You can call them environmental professionals, will collect, and it's either a 5-minute air, 10-minute air sample, but you're collecting a sample from an inside environment that's often it's sedentary, so you don't have air movement, you're not having laminar flow, and eventually gravity is going to win out, which means that you're not going to have
define laminar flow, because I didn't know that.
Well, so it depends. It depends on what reference you want to use, but anywhere to between, I'm going to argue, was a 90 to 120 feet per minute is the amount of air and the speed that it needs to go in order to pull something like a mold spore from location A to location B, or to keep it. You could argue you can keep mold suspended by disturbing it on that carpet that you shouldn't have in the first place, that kind of thing. But eventually it's going to settle out. And so here you have this individual that comes in the home, sets a pump up, collects a sample, and trust me, air sampling gets bashed too much. I know a few people in the industry that just make it sound like the devil. It's not the devil. It's that the people that are selling it aren't doing the education properly. That's the devil. And so it's not that they're worthless, it's that they're worth less. And so they're not detecting the mold fragments. And the mold spores that are being looked at under a microscope, which is this spore trap sample, arguably there perhaps is a better representation of them on the surfaces versus in the air of this sedentary environment. So, I can tie in like 1,000 things. I'll limit it to like 2 or 3. Take Dr. Shoemaker's work where he tried to take the EPA model of a dust sample known as ERMI and he wasn't really concerned with the graph that the EPA created, where there's a lot of debate, and I would agree with the debate. I don't think it as a general tool, as a graph, it's appropriate. You get a lot of false positives, I think, too.
I call it ERMI, good data, bad reporting.
Right. Because individually, you can look at the physiology of the mold and see patterns, like orders of magnitude. You have to consider other factors. But what Richie did is he was saying, listen, what number is what it is. I'm just saying whenever the patients didn't have a 2 or less, they didn't recover. And if their C4A levels were over 20,000, it had to be a 0 or lower. And, he evolved. There was another iteration comes out and published in 2011 from him and Richie Shoemaker and David Lark. And it's this study that says, well, yeah, it was a good tool in its time, but it's evolved, and we have a little bit of too much relapse that we're comfortable with. So let's fine tune this and create a new modeling system called HERTSME. It looks at 5 criteria molds. It's not necessarily the 5 most toxic mold, people. It's the ones that were the most representative for water damage. That's the whole point of, are you living in a water damaged building? Who are we to know? We don't have a hotline to God that says, is this particular species going to affect Mrs. Smith more, or is it going to be, Mrs. Brown?
And was this tracked in by a plumber who was just at a water damaged basement?
Oh yeah, cross contamination. Does the sample actually reflect my home? This is why the subject is so fascinating, because you can go like 8 locations at the same time. But on the task of air versus dust was argued, and there's plenty of older literature that reflects, the value of a dust sample, but it has to be recognized for its limitations too, which is when you sample that dust, does it represent a source in the home? Does it represent just legacy or buildup over months or years from an outside source? Does it represent the plumber's boot that you just brought up a moment ago? And regardless of all those options, which, by the way, it would be nice to know all that, and there's ways that, in other podcasts, I'll discuss how do we look at that. That may not matter for the clinician, because it's not like Richie Shoemaker had a pair of tweezers when he was looking at the mold structures and the fungal fragments, which there are arguably. I'm going to do this only because I told you I brought these documents up if they load up. There's arguably way more fragments in an environment for mold, if we're talking about microbial sources, than there are actually mold spores. And so the guy or girl that goes in there who is just looking at mold spores may miss an exposure that is in fact occurring, that is preventing recovery. Use the model of a CIRS person. And that you get this reaction, and this is something that you've argued about to me, about that you have a classic mold inspector, goes out, does a couple samples, does not find the fragments. It's not identifiable in a spore trap. You can't see it. And then they say you have no problem. Now the mold inspector also becomes a self-appointed clinician on site and tells your patient, you're fine, you're safe, there's no issue. They come back and report that to you. You give them the bad news based off of your markers, your research, and saying, no, you're showing exposure. No, I don't think it's the granola bar that you're eating. And maybe it is. That's part of your role. And it's confusing. So dust samples is probably a better measure a lot of times, but that's not without always considering what is in fact the question that we are asking. In fact, a lot of times I'll still take air samples because I have seen an air sample detect things that a dust sample did not. So it's not a perfect world, but that's what works for me to help define exposure and help us locate sources. You use the example of a wall cavity sample to say, I think there was a leak here. I know there was a leak here. My husband, and maybe this was the gonads comment you were talking about earlier, but my husband does not want to spend $2,000, $3,000, whatever it is, to properly remediate that to known best standards. I wish I had some ancillary data, there it is, that we can sample in the cavity to kind of show that, there's a source here, and we know that wall's not hermetically sealed. And oh, by the way, we found Catonium globosum, a mold species that's a pretty reliable hydrophilic, water-loving mold indicator of damage. And we also found in that dust sample that Dr. Dorninger had you sample. Gee, I wonder if this is where it may be coming from. Well, let's get it remediated. Having the strength, the knowledge, the education to talk about limitations, but also to recognize some of those limitations and say, and this is why we're having you remediate this.
So let's talk about that. So real quick, just to sum up what I've learned, some basics of air samples is you need to really sample the air in multiple areas. Sucking air out of a wall cavity is probably a more concentrated experience. The actual spore trap itself is too large for a lot of the molds we're looking at. Some of the molds we're looking at, like Eutomium and Stachy, tend to be dank and sticky like marijuana resin, and they're going to be more...
Dr. Dorninger hails from Colorado, just for clarification.
Yeah, that's right. we hell out of the great experiment here,
right.
In the Green Rush. And if we could just define limitations of both air sampling, but also Swiffer cloth dust collection. But you brought up the most important thing in my experience, which is we usually, even when we get to the data, you come out and you do everything right, and we actually find some concerns. If it elucidates that the obstacle is the husband doesn't want to deal with this.
Yeah.
They want to stick their head in the sand and say, this is not happening, this is not happening. They don't want to deal with it emotionally. They don't want to deal with it financially. They could have been to the Mayo Clinic and back again, and they're already 70,000 K in, and they've been dealing with this son or this daughter who's been sick forever, right? I'm not judging that they don't want to deal with it. We just now have added the obstacle to cure is now a resistant, sabotaging family member.
Which, by the way, is in my practice, at least when there's a spouse or partner, 50% of the issue. Even if it's on a scale like it's just there's a little bit of resistance, but there is some reluctance to help. And then there's the flat out. I've seen the people get divorced in front of me.
And if we pull back a little bit on that lens, we say, look, we're not here to judge anybody. We're here to keep that integrity, that honesty of what's driving the illness. And we spoke earlier, these patients also come in with SIBO. They also come in with MCAS. They come in with these other disease processes that are absolutely not going to clear until you address CIRS.
Right?
And what we're figuring out with the Geni, which is exciting, is are there subtypes of CIRS? Is there, like Dr. Bernstein talked about in Arizona, is there a mast cell activation or a high histamine CIRS patient? We're going to be able to tease those things out. But what I can tell the audience is you're not going to finish MCAS if you're concomitantly CIRS. You're not going to finish SIBO. You need MSH to animate the gut lining.
Is that picture clear for you as a clinician? Like you're trying to navigate which thing do we tackle first. To the audience member, I'm guessing they're like, I have no clue. That's why I'm paying you.
Yes, well, 100%, because we're pulling reproducible data, and that's the only reason. So again, in my differential diagnosis, in some way, I'm no different than, and obviously more experienced, and I do this day in and day out, but I'm no different than, like, if I have a really smart engineer who has a critically thinking brain and really knows how to use PubMed and really starts scouring the internet and knows how to call, BS from quality articles that aren't trying to sell you something, and they can reference that to PubMed, they can start creating a differential diagnosis themselves. And a lot of times they'll say, I think I have this CIRS thing, secondary to water damage building. And I say, wow, you failed your VCS. You have 10 of 13 cluster symptoms. We should for sure look at that. But by the way, a severe apnea looks exactly like CIRS.
Right. So it's about being open-minded and actually knowing.
I am not mold happy. And that's what even at some of the conferences, you get people who are like, well, you also get the other side, like a Dr. Scott McMahon, our dear homeboy down in New Mexico, fights the good fight day in and day out. But he basically says, if you're not biotoxin, we're done here, basically. And a lot of the people who travel to him, they are biotoxin, so they get figured out. Sure. We are a clinic of mystery illness, right? So if you're not biotoxin, I'm still saying, what are you? Right? A lot of times I get jealous of Scott. I'm like, oh, they weren't biotoxin and you're done.
Right.
But I don't say, oh, you failed all the data for CIRS, so now I'm just going to say you're apnea. No, we do an overnight sleep study. Usually a SNAP, which is a 3-day sleep study. On the kids, you can do overnight oximetry, yada yada yada. We had an airline pilot who was CIRS and apnea. And guess what? He put $40K into addressing that dishwasher you were talking about.
Yeah.
Then we learned, hey, I think I'm getting the hand of this. He belonged to this awesome church for 18 years that fed the homeless, and he went every week to do that. Really good stuff, right? And he says all the ceiling tiles are hanging with water stain.
Yeah.
CIRS markers were still high. I was super sad about that. He needed to find a new church that was safe for him.
Yeah.
That was going to be a $300,000 fix,
right?
To clean that place up. So that was sad. So he did that, and all his CIRS markers normalized. He still wasn't feeling good. Then we screened him for apnea. Today we would screen him for apnea much quicker, and he was also apnea. So we had 2 building exposures. Then the CIRS markers finally came down. C4a, TGF-beta, MMP9 normalized. But he still wasn't well, right? If that was just a CIRS case, he's better, right?
Yeah.
So in bringing that back to what we were just talking about, the whole thing drives on integrity, right? And why I'm so grateful for you and I'm so grateful for Dr. Shoemaker really is, if we didn't have the heavy lifting he did to prove the pathway and to prove that the protocol works, I wouldn't know what to do with mold.
Yeah.
I couldn't do the woo-woo kind of like, I mean, when I first got into this and I was evaluating whether I wanted Dr. Shoemaker to be my mentoring guide on CIRS, I was reading stuff like, put an onion in your basement. It will attract the spores and make the basement mold free.
There you have it.
I mean, and listen, I was CIRS illiterate. I was mold illiterate too as a doctor, where everyone in my house is fatigued. My little guy with double dreaded gene, he was so profoundly sick and got so awesomely better when we did the protocol. I thought we were off to Children's Hospital for juvenile rheumatoid arthritis because he had this chronic joint pain, headache, tummy pain, and constant fatigue. And there's so many days of school. We cleaned up the home. We got him through the protocol, and everything resolved, right? So I got to see it firsthand. But if it wasn't for Dr. Shoemaker's reproducibility, we wouldn't have reproducible data markers to say you're CIRS or you're not. And that's what prevents us from being mold happy. Now we have things like the Neuroquant and the Geni that are saying, oh, you're CIRS secondary to water damage building and you're CIRS secondary to Lyme tick bite.
Right.
Or, it's not a water damage building issue. You're not showing those inflammatory markers. It's a Lyme tick bite, or it's Pfiesteria from the Chesapeake Bay, or so on and so forth.
Right, and that is the salivating part for at least the IEPs. Eventually, that'll evolve into something commercial that we can use to sample with, and where we have meaning. I get a lot of clients will call us up as, do you do mycotoxin testing? Because a lot of folks are doing the urine analysis, which, by the way, I don't want to debate about that. I know there's pros and cons and there's different methodologies. Here's my point. You got to be able to understand how to interpret it. Like, what's a normal background environment? It's not like molds. And we've been picking on molds. I want to pick on a couple other quick things other than that.
Can I say a quick thing about urinary mycotoxin testing?
Go for it.
There is no reproducible validation to show that is diagnostic of CIRS, or that it sets you on a path to any treatment that graduates patient.
Okay, so now imagine that client, they're struggling, which is a lot of folks. They are working with you. You are one of the few doctors that I know that are rigid, to put it nicely, for a good reason. I
would call it honest.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Right. Okay.
We're honestly rigid.
Yeah.
Rigid and honest.
Well, yeah. No one appreciates it until they recover, and then they thank you. That person maybe in their journey heard about some test. They go do it. It's called it's a urine analysis. They send it to a couple of well-known labs. Comes back and it shows some exposure. Whether or not it's reproducible, whether or not as a clinician you can use that, a lot of times it still trickles down to the IEP. And I will tell you that for the IEPs that are listening right now, the word mycotoxin is starting to be used as just as much as mold spores now. I mean, it's right there. And that's the problem. Is it's about when you have integrity and you have passion, you are probably going to be a good enough IEP, because you at that moment you'll be able to explain to the client, well, we don't know what a normal background level is. We can't measure your exposure based off of the limitations or sensitivity limitations of the equipment doing the analysis. We don't have a study that's at least other than from stuff from third world country that I've heard has come from other docs to say this is what we would expect, because no one wants to hear you should have this many mold mycotoxins in their home as background any more than they want to hear this is normal fungal ecology in your home. No one wants to hear it, but that's a reality. It's not about mold free, and it's about the education beyond integrity. I guess that's my segue, is a good IEP, and what works for what has worked for me is you said it, honesty, but explanation, education, explaining what we know, what we don't know, and why, regardless of whether we test, say we do an ERMI sample or a Hertzme sample or some sort of a gram-negative positive bacteria type sample, are we going to still recommend remediation because we know the more of the bigger picture fundamentals? Like, let's pick on a crawl space. Crawl spaces are arguably, I know Colorado likes to hail more basements than crawl spaces, but even for those in the California area, crawl spaces are the big thing. And I've yet to find a crawl space that doesn't have a moisture issue to a level that we're worried about communication from the crawl space through the subfloor, through various pathways, penetrations in the home. And some homes are so bad that a homeowner will just kind of casually tell me, this would be like a person with diagnosed CIRS or what, I get a musty smell in our master bedroom, and that's where there's the service access door to the crawl space. And I feel worse. It's a classic. Sometimes it can be linear. You can look at it and go, well, I can't prove this like a murder case, but you got this big elephant in the room that maybe you want to address. And it's easy when the solution is $20 in weather stripping around the access panel door to prevent that pathway or to minimize it. But sometimes that's not enough. It becomes an issue when you tell a client they need to install some sort of moisture barrier, dehumidification, and exterior drainage solutions around their crawl space that may equal $30,000. And that's the tough road to hoe. And that's the, not to keep on bringing up the word gonads, but I think that this is truth. This is hard talk, because this is often what people struggle with the most. It's not the easy thing that I can point at. It's the stuff that we know can affect you. When you go in the crawl space to get out your seasonal holiday stuff that you're down for the count from 2 weeks, but you stay away from the crawl space, but you don't want to spend the money to fix it. You're not getting the obstacle out of the way or an obstacle out of the way, and you're wondering why you're not recovering following some protocol that has the data to show it works. It's repeatable.
That's it. Who is that? Is it Allstate? Mayhem? They do the character Mayhem?
Yeah, right.
You and I could go off on like 50 CIRS commercials and be like, I'm a crawl space that wasn't vented properly, or you could be like, I'm a gutter and I'm a stoned Colorado roofer and I smoked too much weed that day and didn't put in the gutter right. It's like, and it all comes back to the integrity of construction practices is the biggest issue here.
And construction defects. Yeah.
If you have the gene and you don't get the exposure, who builds flat roof buildings?
We do in Arizona.
This is what we do in schools, right? And then we're like, now Timmy needs Ritalin and Geni wants to kill herself.
Right.
And why don't we pull CIRS markers on those kids? What I find with the level of depression and suicidal ideation, a lot of those cases are CIRS. And I will self-disclose my story of having a flagrantly elevated MMP9 and how I wanted to drive my car into a telephone pole because I was so flagrantly depressed from a chemical marker. You and I are both blue-collar backgrounds who graduated to middle class and get to live a blessed life, and we're passionate about what we do. And my life circumstances at this point are really reasonable. You shouldn't want to drive your car into a telephone pole.
Right.
If your MMP9 hits 1023, your blood-brain barrier is broken open, inflammation is spilled into the brain, you have brain on fire, you will not feel good, right? And I think it's so important to just pull that whole conversation back to an integrity issue. And if someone spends $700 on urinary mycotoxin testing, I try and have the grace to sincerely slow down the conversation and say, I'm not here to pick on any practitioners. I'm just telling you, I'm bummed we spent $700 on the test that we could have used toward mitigation.
Well, you're true in that. Okay.
We don't have time to waste money on misdiagnoses. We don't have time to waste because, and hold your thought because I want to hear it. But as kind of blue collar background guys who made it to the middle class, I'm sure you feel a sense of relief when you get on a house and you're like, this family's affluent enough to do the testing I actually need to hold honesty and integrity on. Did this building truly get a shakedown? Did I really evaluate this building so I can give them clean diagnostics? And even then, we know we've had you on cases where you were the hero of the day, and that's 9 out of 10 times. And then there's about 10% that despite all the tools, despite having your brain, we're still not going to find every water damage exposure unless we do
You're not only right, but that's the difference between me and the other guy is that, and there's other good colleagues that practice the same discipline, is for those 10%. Part of that story also includes knowing that limitations with the client ahead of time, not surprising them at the very end, and then saying, by the way, maybe there's something here that we can do holistically. Think of it like your equivalent in clinic practice as good dieting or more yoga. Maybe there's a timing issue. Likewise, you don't crack somebody's neck with high inflammation, just like you don't necessarily clean a house. Maybe if there's 20 square feet of mold, on the living room wall, you might want to address that first, or else it's redundant or not as effective. But are there ways in a more humid climate we need to get that moisture level down? Are there filtration methods available to help lower smaller particles that won't settle out with gravity and diffuse like smoke in the environment? Knowing that good house cleaning efforts are also part of that plan. Can we bring in fresh air? Mechanical fresh air from the outside done the right way to dilute the contaminants that an air filter won't collect.
Can you expand upon that? Because I think we've had 3 cases, 3 clients you've been in where that's made a difference with your leadership on that. That's an important.
I think the issue is eventually whether or not we've it's all about, the term I use is drawing the line in the sand, and people ask me, where do you draw the line in the sand? Well, I go, I don't, not as your doctor, but as an IEP, I go where the history and or the visual evidence stops. So if there's evidence of a problem, I'm going to pursue it. But I'm not going to say to you, because there's a lot of fear factor and there's a lot of scare tactics, right or wrong. Social media is really causing a lot of grief. That's another podcast that says you need to rip the whole building down. It's like no building, first of all, is a bubble, a sterile bubble. It's about is it enough? Is it clean enough? So when you get to the point where you've identified potential sources and or pathways and you have addressed them, there's thousands of examples that we're not going to go into right now. You start to also get into the issue of sustainability. So think of it as a 2-prong approach. Prong 1 is assessment and diagnosis of the home and removal of that obstacle. Phase 2 is prevention of it happening in the future. And so it's with air filtration, what we're trying to do is say, we're not trying to sell you a bill of goods here. We don't think that if you put a portable air filtration device, I think they all work pretty darn good, to be honest with you. And there's a difference between that and purification, which if we have time, we'll get into, versus a whole house system where you have a furnace or a heat pump and you put that standard little filter in there. This is a part of the whole. And I learned this actually from one of the high value clients that you were referring to, where that was the phrase she loved to use, was it's part of the whole. Air filtrations is part of the whole. It's saying there are smaller particles that can stay suspended and do stay suspended. Think about those mold fragments we were talking about sooner that can be removed. I'm not worried about 99.97% at 3 microns. Great, let's get you there with a nice, good, efficient filter, but it's not like 85% sucks. And keep in mind, that's per pass. And so you want to filter the air to totally lower the total load or burden of particulate. And usually it's going to be the smaller particles that don't fall with gravity, to lower the potential of exposure. Because when your doctor tells you about mold spores, when they talk to you about mold fragments, when they talk to you about mycotoxins, when they talk to you about chemicals, a lot of these things combine on particles. They attach. There's some sort of a positive negative attraction, or a weak bond of sort, and that can get removed from the environment. But if you don't clean your house up, you don't wipe down the home on an environmental on a regular basis, that filter is not going to remove those particles, but they're still there and they still can get resuspended. So that addresses that part. But you're waiting for me to talk about mechanical ventilation. Sometimes, a lot of times, an air filter can't remove even the lighter weight. We haven't taken the time just yet to elaborate on the fact that CIRS-WDB, water damage building, isn't just picking on mold or even microorganisms. It includes other potential inflammatory agents like VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Well, a lot of these, whether they're man-made, like from paints or building materials, that may be off-gassing, or MVOCs, microbial VOCs, that are coming from presumably an active source, they're not going to be removed effectively with your standard Home Depot 1-inch pleated air filter. And so we incorporate outdoor fresh air And that's a relative term because if you're living in an industry in the burbs of Chicago that may not, or Detroit, you may not get such clean air. But for a lot of people, they're fortunate, regardless of, how high up on the hill they're living, to have the ability to bring in that air. You still want to filter it. What if it's a high pollen count day? You still want to dry it out if you're in a more humid climate. You want to warm it up. What if we're in Colorado and it's in the middle in the winter? I don't want really cold air coming into my ductwork system and causing a number of issues, including heating and comfort issues. You have equipment like heating recovery ventilators and energy recovery ventilators, mechanical ventilation devices that can bring in this fresh air and dilute or purge, sometimes a combination of both, that those contaminants that build up in your home. Because remember, everybody, we live in boxes. So things build up. If you got 10 units of contaminant A outside, you're probably going to have more than 10 inside, unless there's some atypical cause of why you wouldn't. But you normally have more. So you're hitting this from multiple parts to holistically address the home. And the top three, well, I should say four, where applicable for your climate, and that's really just the moisture one, is regulating moisture. You'll hear different levels. We typically say, you'll hear me a lot of times say less than 50%. 40 to 60% relative humidity is a pretty safe margin. And it also kind of is the best of a lot of different worlds, like reduction of dust mites, not low enough to be worried about viruses or exposure in drier climates or respiratory issues. We're worried about filtration. That's the second thing, filtering the air. If somebody asked me, well, I put a MERV 16 in our furnace, do you think we should buy a portable one for my son's bedroom? I usually say, go for it. I'm not saying, it's overkill or not overkill, but if you're wanting to further reduce the load and maybe it's helpful, try it out. See if they got a 30-day money back guarantee. Problem solved. And then, of course, you got the third thing, which is mechanical ventilation to further dilute and purge. And in some applications, even provide a little bit of a protective invisible barrier, this pressure boundary, where you're trying to keep these pathways and these driving forces that want to go into the home at bay. It's not like a shield, something out of a superheroes movie, but it's just a long-term, holistic, like eating healthy preventative. And then finally, it's living, it's lifestyle. If you are somebody with old carpeting, if you're a hoarder, if you got a lot of surface areas, that it's not that we think you're sniffing or snorting or licking those surfaces, but that contributes to the total picture. And your miracle air filtration unit that's tucked in the corner in your living room is not just going to suck all the particles out of the air. They're not going to beeline it towards the filter. They're going to diffuse somewhat the way they're going to go. And that's why you can't tell somebody, well, if you just put a better filter in there, you're probably going to solve everything. Usually it's multi-pronged. For the people that can afford it, they'll usually do all of it. What we try to do is not leave those hanging when they're on a week-to-week budget. We try to find, well, what is the low-hanging fruit? Well, I don't know what the low-hanging fruit is. If you live in Hawaii, maybe the low-hanging fruit is your moisture control. But if you're in Colorado, we're not really worried about moisture control. Maybe it's lifestyle changes before you're throwing $2,000-$3,000 towards these types of equipment.
Yeah, I just learned a lot. I'm going to have to.
That's why there's a rewind button.
Well, I'm going to have to think about 15 things that just came up that we're going to have to refine later.
Yeah, maybe podcast episode 2.
Maybe podcast episode 2. But in some, there's a couple things I'd like to add off what you just said. See, now, my personal experience is even if you're socioeconomically incapable of doing what you need to do to get better, that's still the truth. And what I found other practitioners do is they try and come up with shortcuts that do not work, that spend money anyway, even if it's 10, 20% of the money, we need to do it right the first time. And I much would rather pose, this is the honest problem. Concomitantly, an honest problem is we don't have the money to do it. Now it puts a potential solution on the table where maybe we can get an affluent uncle in to sponsor something. Maybe we do realize that house isn't going to work for them, and we need to find some Section 8 Boulder housing that's a new build, right? I'd rather stay integral with what the problem is than cut corners to watch poor people never get access to better health, right? No. And I'm the first to admit, if you have the financial resources to fix buildings, you have a better chance at this. But what I found even more important is attitude. And if you find people who are lower middle class, I mean, again, if you're totally indigent, maybe this is a different conversation, but even in our lower middle class, if you're willing to prioritize what you need to do, right? You're not lower socioeconomic class and walking into our office with an iPhone 10, right? Because there's that story too, where people are tight on money, but the way they prioritize their money isn't to get to clean building. And that's where we just try and keep the conversation honest throughout. That's all I really want. And then I want to teach people how to be empowered, not panicked. And I think what you're bringing to the table is this concept in naturopathic medicine, which is total load. So there's lots of straws that add up to break the camel's back on a building. And maybe if we can't get out of the building, but we have $900, we buy a IQ Air Professional Series and put that in that sick child's bedroom, and at least start turning over air in that 10 by 12 room.
Right. And we get into the weeds, Eric, because you start, and then I mean, as a solution, you're saying, well, can we talk to the apartment management and talk about removing that carpet? Because we also know that that would help you further with the reduction of particulate, and then let's track symptoms or whatever it is that you're working with your clinician on to show progress or exposure.
And I want to share something that I've been observing anecdotally, and I mean this anecdotally, is this sicker, quicker phenomenon we are not seeing if we can get people truly in clean buildings for 6 months. And where you come in is we're trying to create an air palace for someone to come home to. Right. You're spending at least 8 hours there to sleep. You're spending more hours there to just hang out on the weekends, to do dinner together, yada, yada, yada. And if we can get all of your buildings clean for 6 months, I've noticed the HLA anecdotally, and we want to start pulling data on this. I'm hiring a new doc for fall 2020, and she has a lot of data mining experience. But what I've been seeing anecdotally is if we can get 6 months, we really kind of put the jack back in the box in regards to those genetics, in regards to the HLA. So the bullet goes back into the chamber, right? And then what I see is people can get a little bit more building liberal. They can use cholestyramine and Welcol and BIP and EDTA silver to kind of triage those exposures so they can live a little bit again. But we have to stay honest with the conversation. We have to be empowered, not panicked. Right. I'm actually going to speak to the mold support group in Colorado. And one of my biggest topics I want to get across them is CIRS doesn't define you as a human being. It's something you need to get honest with. You need to get real. You need to dig deep. You need to pull on every financial resource you need to get through it. But then once you get through it, your world can expand. And we don't want you, if you come back to the mold group, we want you to be a leader on optimism and dedication and the grit and grind you needed to get to the other side, but to display to people like myself, I am now a functioning, cognitively intact, non-depressed, non-suicidal, non-joint pained human being who can go crush some jiu-jitsu and CrossFit and go take care of my dad and try and be a good dad myself, and so on and so forth. So I think we also get into people are finding this illness as their identity. And it's very dangerous. You don't want to identify as a CIRS person.
Well, and look at why they're doing it. I mean, I know we won't go 5 minutes deep in it, but just to say, a lot of it is they don't know. They're lost. I'm not saying this mainly. I'm saying this more to the audience.
Well, it's the three guilty parties again, right?
That's right. You need to add social media to that too.
We could add social media to that. We know stories about the Moldy movie and some of the intention behind that movie. Even though good tool of awareness, there was some dark intention. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel personally that people can be predatory to any disease. You take cancer patients, you take mold victims, you take Lyme victims, and we are tired, we are gullible, we are desperate, we are scared, and that is the perfect person for the predator. Right. Yeah. And again, why you and I got on so well from the beginning, I'm like, This guy cares about doing things right. He cares about people. He needs to make a living for his family, but he doesn't need to drive the Tesla. He just wants to see people graduate. Yeah. Right. And we can do that in an empowered way, in a way that's not panicked. And I love sometimes in the appropriate manner, self-disclosing the story of my family of dreaded genes, and that my son plays soccer and basketball and football. My other does parkour, and we're all dreaded genes. Yeah. Right. And again, we can't go to a school that is documented moldy and expect everyone's healthy. We can't have our own home unfixed water damage and expect to live the way we're functioning right now. Right. We just got back from Winter Park, and guess what we rented? We rented a new build condo, right? That was statistically my best chance. And on the Airbnb, it said, don't mind the non-5-star. We just put our place on the market. And I actually did a little real estate research and saw that those are just developed. Sad to say, when we left, one of the windows had a little bit of cracked caulk, a little bit of water staining, but the place was totally fine because there probably wasn't enough time yet for this to turn into a mold brew stew. Right?
So you nailed the whole thing about not letting this thing define you. I understand that there's the outliers, the people that are really in bad shape, but that's not what I'm seeing subjectively as the theme. I've had the true privilege to work with either virtually or on boots on the ground with, it's got to be now thousands of clients, and the theme is more that people do have control of their life, but they know that something's not right. But there are the outliers, and usually the outliers are the ones that are running from a mold spore. Got news for you. Since you've been listening to us talk, you've inhaled a bunch, and that's just normal. And your body, you don't live in a bubble. And I won't rehash totally everything you said, but that is a huge point. You talk about truth is having to reel back in or pull people off the ledge of being that susceptible. We even start talking about, I'm gonna do the best I can to explain the science of this and the physiology of this. But beyond that, maybe there's some neural retraining. I don't know what your opinion is on that, but I've heard a lot of subjective.
I've seen things like DNRS, if people commit to it as a complementary therapy, be profoundly beneficial.
Right. Basically, the 30-second, and I'm sure I'll butcher this, so you can correct me, Eric, is basically it's kind of addressing that flight or fight mechanism, and really having you have understanding and control of how you mentally, I know there's a better word for it, respond to a thought or a concern, and you do it in a healthy way. It's not about ignoring something. It's just about redefining what it actually is.
Well, I would say, and we don't have the data yet to show the logistics of it, but the immune system is under the control of the brain, right? And the brain is under the control of the immune system, right? So we're probably going to see that some of this brain retraining helps dampen genetic expression of chronic inflammation. We don't have proof for that, but that's probably what is happening. I will say the reverse, where I've never seen DNRS heal a CIRS patient. Right? It's only the Shoemaker protocol. You have to remove the obstacle to cure.
And I think our audience knows that, though. I mean, unless there's something we don't know, I don't think that anybody heard DNRS or what is the cure. It's just another good tool.
I've seen it be amazing, and even just get people off the PTS of CIRS, of being scared of variability. Empowered and panic, you walk into a cafe, it smells like a wet dog, it's not your cafe. You walk back out. You don't, right? You're watching your kid play basketball at a school that's a little bit funky. You're going to reboot your cholestyramine and your Walcol. You know, there's ways to do this. You're not, 2 weeks later, you still feel like dog do. You call Dorninger's office, and we pull some markers to see if C4A and MMP9 went batshit again on you. You know,
your life is not over. It's
most of our patients get healthier than they've ever been before if we can follow the protocol succinctly. So I got to go run and jump in a cold river, literally, for a birthday party. My buddy turned 42 and he wants to go for a hike and then do a little Wim Hof.
That's fine. Before I go, let me just ask you for the audience benefit. So I know you're in Boulder, Colorado. If folks are looking for you in state, I'm guessing this is the best way to reach you?
Yeah, drdorninger.com. What we do is a 10-minute free consult for potential new patients. I just want to screen to make sure we're highly likely to help you. There are things that I don't do. If you're calling me for complementary approach to breast cancer, we don't do cancer. Sometimes we're the first responder to find it in our diagnostics. But I interview you. I make sure you understand we do not cut corners. We don't make a penny on labs, but if we do bill insurance for labs, but some of those labs are not covered that we need on a mystery illness case. They're mom and pop companies. You got to know what you're in for. Financially, it makes no sense for you to come in if I can't get my diagnostics. Everything else is just, these are the things I think it is, and I bat about 60, 70% right. 30 to 40%, I'm off, and the data save the day, as Dr. Shoemaker would say. And then the third criteria is, are you willing to follow a treatment plan? And that can be, again, it can be, you run into it 100 times where some husband goes like, we're not doing anything, I'm fine in this house. And I have to say something politely like, hey, if you ever want to get laid again and want your wife to have libido, and by the way, remember your name because she could be going into inhalation dementia, you listen to what we're finding on the data here and why she didn't get figured out at Mayo and 10 other places. But it sucks when you get to a diagnosis and then people aren't resourced to do the treatment plan. They're not willing to do the treatment plan. There's resistance players in their relational dynamics to the treatment plan, so on and so forth. So
what about those people? What about, sorry, I just want to say, what about the people that are not local? Because I know there's going to be people that are listening that like your model, like your approach. What if they're in Arizona or New York?
So about a third of our practice is out of state. And for malpractice insurance and 100 other reasons, you come and see us once. We have the whole, I call it medical tourism thing, figured out where the staff takes care of you, shows you some new build hotels that you come and see us, you stay overnight, and then we pull your blood the next morning, and then we can do a lot of telemedicine because I've seen you in person. We'll also often have you get your first heart scan and carotid ultrasound because we don't want to win the battle, lose the war. You're all better from CIRS, and you premature stroke or heart attack on us, right? So we might, things like sleep studies, we can ship to your house. We do have a facility that does neuroquant. And we can pull Geni for the most complicated cases. Now, because of Geni's cost, we're not doing Geni on everybody. I'd love that data. As you know, Geni is just getting rolled out. It's just getting refined. But we do have a handful of CIRS patients who are doing everything right, and they're not better yet. It's about 5%, and that's who we're using the Geni on at this point. What are we missing? And I bet, as you know from the conference, we're probably going to see there's an actinomyces exposure or there's an endotoxin exposure that we're not picking up with traditional IEP methods yet, and have to get into some of the funkier stuff. So
that's certainly the hope and the goal. And listen, Eric, thank you for your time. I know you're a busy man, and it means a lot.
We have to keep it rolling. It's for you and I, it's overwhelming, and we've dedicated our lives to this. Right. And we have so many chapters. I don't think people know that you did HVAC before doing all this. Right. If you have someone who did blue collar boots on the ground construction or HVAC, they have such an advantage as an IEP because they know how to think like water. They know how to think like bad construction practice problems. They saw it getting built improperly. Same thing with me. I graduated into CIRS. We figured out a lot of other pathways that cause illness, but about 50% of our mystery illness cases, no one knows why the heck they're ill, still come back to CIRS-WDB. Then we get into about 10-20% are CIRS from other biotoxin sources, and then the others aren't CIRS. We're not CIRS happy. It's just the criteria is so defined and it's so easy to identify, and the difficulty is the treatment of remove patient from exposure. Your world is where it gets wild and adventurous.
Wild West. It's beyond the science of my practice and your practice. It is an art, and I don't honestly know of too many clinicians, I can count them on one hand, who have a heart, and I mean this sincerely, as big as yours. And you're real, you're human, and this is the biggest compliment I ever get from people about my own approach is the humanistic part, putting it down, getting it down to their level, but not just, bar napkin idea in it, like really showing the science and then just putting it together. Eric is one of those people. If you are interested in reaching out to him, you can see his website on the screen right now. I'm going to list his information on the podcast information as well. And hopefully in the future, well, I'm sure we could probably go like another 20 rounds on podcasting with this guy. So I look forward to speaking.
Well, I love that, that you feel that, because we want people to feel comfortable. We want them to feel safe. We also want them to know the honest truth. And I think if you're working with a heroin addict and you never done heroin, you're limited. Right. As when I work with CIRS patients, I'm a dreaded gene. I married a dreaded gene. We made a single dreaded gene older child, a double dreaded gene younger child. We've had 41 isolated water damage experiences in one home. I had one of the most top 10 difficult Marcon's cases known to man. God wants me to know biotoxin illness. Yeah. And when you're an academic and you study that, but you really have the blue collar experience, you're a weirdo if you don't feel for this patient population.
Right. Well, that's what they're missing. They need the glue that holds it together. And that's where a lot of general practice, even poor bedside manner from somebody who can be brilliant, can get in the way of the ultimate goal, which is recovery. Because meanwhile, you misinterpreted something, but you had a Facebook friend who's acting like a doctor for everybody because they had one episode and they're projecting that this is the case for everybody, and you're just lost. You need to have somebody who can be the beacon, who can be the captain. And it's folks like you working in the field, helping not just them, but helping us better understand, okay, here's where we need to focus on. Here's where you're seeing it. It's just the nickel dime, the discounting of a sample, or the limitation of a sample, but making it like there's no problem when really there is a problem, because old traditional methodology of sampling in an environment comes from industry where we were looking for acute exposures. This may be what some of the people listening right now have had happen to them, which is typically why, with you and me, by the time we hear from somebody, they've already been through a slew of other people. We're not typically the first phone call.
No, and I wish we were, because it's wasted time and money, and I don't hold that against anyone. This is complicated stuff, and you got to be willing to dedicate your life to understanding the nuances. So
absolutely.
For those who are out there dealing with CIRS, hang in there and find someone who can do their best to accurately get to diagnosis and treatment, and then also address some of the comorbidities. But if you don't get the CIRS out of the way, you're futzing around with all the other pathology.
Eric, thank you. Thank you for your time and your wisdom.
Michael, right back at you. To be continued.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good to see you, brother. All right.
The content of this show is for informational purposes and represents the sole opinion of the host and its interviewees only. Any reliance on the information provided in this show is done at your own risk. Additional opinions and/or research may change our current view of the topics spoken in this show. We do our best to minimize any inaccuracies presented and make legitimate efforts to back all comments with our own field experience, independent literature, or studies that support the topics discussed. This information should not be used to make conclusive decisions regarding your health or exposure. Ultimately, all questions and/or concerns regarding your health should be addressed by a qualified physician. Additional exposure concerns and/or questions pertaining to the health of your home or building should be addressed by qualified and on-site professionals. Any and all products and services discussed in this show should not be construed as a recommendation, endorsement, or guarantee that their use is appropriate for your situation. In short, we hope this information is of value to you, but please do not act upon it without actual and individual consultation and guidance by professionals who have taken the time and appropriate collection of data to assess your unique situation.